Open Source Security's guest today is Gary Kramlich. Gary, tell us why you're here, man.
So I'm here because I am the current lead developer of Pidgin Instant Messenger, which you may all remember used to be called Game as well.
I do remember that.
So Game was originally created in 1998, believe it or not, over 26 years ago now. And I'm here to talk about how we've managed to somehow keep the program around and keep the code base, I guess, maintainable, editable, whatever you want to call it.
Yes. I mean, so that's why I asked you here today, is we often think of open source as this thing that someone wrote maybe months ago, maybe a year or two ago, and we don't think about the fact that there is a lot of open source that has been around for a very long time. And I can't say what version of GCC you would have even started on way back in the day, but I mean, even the C standard, right? I mean, you were probably like C99 or something at the time.
No, 89. We were
89.
C89 and ANSI C for up until we released Finch. A lot of people don't remember Finch. So when more specifically, when Pidgin, with Game 1.0, one of our big features was the core UI split, where we took the core instant messaging stuff and split it off to its own library, and then we had UIs built on top of that. When that happened, we also created Finch at the time. Well, it wasn't called Finch. It was called Game Curses, or I don't remember the exact name. And it was an Ncurses interface to libpurple. And when that came out is when we adopted C99 because we wanted to use struct initializers in Finch.
Oh my goodness.
So that's when we went to C99. And that was circa 2005, 2006 or so.
Wow.
So,
wow. Are you still stuck on C99 or have you moved out?
No. So the Pidgin 2 code base is been kind of stuck in limbo for a long time. There's a long story there that I'll touch on in a bit here, but many years ago, so back in January of 2016, I lobbied to take over the project as the lead developer, mostly because I was pushing for a big initiative in libpurple, what we were calling G-objectification, which was to make the library use G-objects, which is a sub-library from glib that lets you do basically OOP stuff in C. But the big reason we wanted to do that was that way we would have reference counting on everything, because nothing in Pidgin 2 has reference counting. There is, you have to be very, very particular about ownership of pointers and very careful. And basically, if you're using something, you probably don't own it, so don't free it. It's ultimately what it comes down to. But you run into a number of bugs and stuff like that. So I was pushing for this whole thing. And parts of it got implemented across a couple summer code projects. But because libpurple is a library, right, it has to have library versioning with library guarantees. So one of the problems we ran into there is, as this work started happening to rewrite that backend, or rewrite the stuff in libpurple to use G-objects, it was going to be an API and ABI break. So it had to become the next major version. The problem is that work was never fully realized. It was like probably 95% of the way there, but it wasn't there. So everybody kept putting new features into the 3.0 branch because that's where you would have to put new features and stuff. And then the Pidgin 2 and libpurple 2 branch just kind of sat and got old over time. So in 2016, I was on hiatus for a bit, only doing a little bit stuff here and there. But in 2016, I lobbied to take over because I was the one lobbying for that change that kind of halted the project and wanted to bring it back. So after I took over lead developer, one of the things I did was we changed our C standard from C99 to C17. So we did a huge jump there right away. But then we started doing all sorts of other stuff, like trying to modernize basically everything in the code base. Because one of the big problems we had, and one of the reasons why we got so stymied, I guess is the word I'm looking for, is our code base. Like, people have commented that it was lots of really clean and easy to understand C, and I don't know what parts of the code base they read, but they're not the ones I spent time in. So one of the things we've been doing going forward is we're trying to make the code base less scary and easier to understand. Like, there's a bunch of lexical parsers that are in here that are just, nightmares to try to modify or do anything. And being a network-based application, there's basically no unit tests. So you change one of those parsers and I don't know, figure out a way to test it, like as integration test, because you have nothing automated to do it and stuff like that. So, there's a lot of that stuff going on of like trying to clean that up, but more importantly, like just making the code easier to understand in general and less complicated.
Okay, let me ask about that, because one of the traditional complaints I think you hear from any developer, especially open source developers, is that there's never any time to do that kind of preventative maintenance aspect of being a developer. It's all about, we're going to work on new features. We're going to work on the new things, the things we want to do next. But what you just described was taking a code base and essentially modernizing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds obviously like a lot of work, but I also suspect when you have an application that's, we'll say, old enough to drink, that if you want to remain relevant and have developers, you have to do this stuff, right? Because you can't be stuck in the past and expect a modern developer to use C99, for example.
Right. I mean, to be fair, most of the C standard stuff gets hidden behind glib. That's the library we use. It's at the very bottom of the GNOME stack. So most of that, or that hides a lot of stuff, but like language features like struct initializer, stuff like that comes in handy. But the, like I was saying, we've purchased in Google Summer Code a number of times, but we haven't had a lot of those contributors stick around, and we've never done like exit interviews or anything with them. But my, gut feeling is that they suffered through the code base for 3 months and they didn't want to come back. Right. But so one of the other things is like, just when it comes from even maintaining the project, like you've got to have a way to have confidence in the code that you're writing and stuff, right? So like, as we've been going forward, as we've been rewriting things and cleaning up the G-object stuff and all that, we've been making things testable. And we have been putting in lots of tests, even if they're just basic tests like, does the constructor function work correctly and return the right type? Yeah, good, cool, right? We've got some coverage, because I have this theory that you're much more likely to get somebody to contribute an update rather than create something from scratch. And what I mean by that is, like, when you're writing the documentation, having documentation that's maybe a little wrong or has typos is better than no documentation at all, because it's a lot less of a barrier to entry to fix that, what's wrong, rather than write the whole thing. Likewise for the unit test, right? So if the entire structure of the unit test is there and somebody wants to add a new feature, okay, well, all they have to do is add their specific unit test now, rather than add the entire test harness and blah, blah, blah. So we've been trying to do a lot of that stuff to make that easier, and make it so that people actually can have an enjoyable time contributing, rather than going, this sucks, but I need this feature, so I'm just going to, grin and bear it and get through it and go from there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's funny you say this, and it's very obvious, but it doesn't always feel obvious, right? When you're kind of in the middle of it. Okay, so you just described taking an older code base, kind of updating it, making it more, I guess, more or current, more standard. I don't know what the word I'd use necessarily is, but like, what are some of the challenges of that? Say going from C99 to C17, like what does that look like? If someone's looking to, I mean, I'm sure there are lessons, for example, having to make the move from like Python 2 to 3, from any language as it evolves and upgrades. These are things that occur, right?
Yeah. So like I was saying earlier, like the language specifications haven't affected us too much. Like aside from like, being able to declare a variable in a for loop, that's something that's newer than C99. Actually, that might have been in C99, but we didn't have that anywhere because, legacy reasons. But like the bigger issue has been keeping up with glib and GTK in particular, because them being compatibility layers and toolkits and stuff, they're dealing with way more of that than we need to. But like a lot of GTK's paradigm changed a lot, because Pidgin 2 is still GTK 2. And when I first took over the project, I should be clear too. So when I say I took over the project, I actually got involved with the project in 2003 when it was still game. And then in 2016, I took it over. But when I first took it over, the code base still it was still using auto tools, which we'll touch on that in a second.
Wow.
And it had configured flags to use GTK2 or GTK3, which meant that we had a compatibility layer or we were just treating GTK3 like GTK2. So after GTK4 came got released and, had a stable release and all that. It was a matter of, what are we doing? Number one, we need to just get rid of GTK 2. But, okay, so now we're on GTK 3, but this is already in maintenance mode. Why would we literally write tech debt?
Sure.
So then we ported everything to GTK 4. And we tried to do that in place as much as we could, but we had a separate GTK 4 branch where we had to port everything because you can't intermingle them. And I think it took us somewhere between 6 and 7 months to get everything ported over to GTK 4.
That feels like a pretty quick port.
I mean, being there, it didn't. But to be fair, more to your point, right? So Pidgin doesn't have any full-time developers. I'm the closest thing we have to a full-time developer, and I've structured my professional life and stuff so that I can maximize the amount of time I can spend on Pidgin. Aside from that, our other core developer is actually full-time on another open source project, and he works on Pidgin part-time. And then we have what we call a crazy patch writer that goes through, reviews our patches and tries to fix his little bugs, stuff like that. And that's the team right now. That's the entire team.
That's impressive.
So, I mean, I guess when you look at it that way, 7 months doesn't sound like that much, especially for that. But like when I was there in the trenches, it felt long.
I mean, no, for sure. Like I remember porting things from Python 2 to 3. I'll use like that's the universe I lived in the most and probably the most disruption I've seen. And yes, supporting new libraries, supporting, whatever your new toolkit is underneath, all of that stuff it is hard to do and it is thankless. And it is, I won't say it's terrible, but it hurts sometimes,
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
Weird bugs show up.
Yeah, like there's one of the big things in GTK 4, and they started doing it in GTK 3, is they have so much stuff is built upon their new list type. And we had to like convert things into G objects so that we could put them into lists, and then we'd have to build everything built on the list and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of that took a lot of time because like the GTK 4 branch didn't compile forever, right? So it was our pull requests were like, I verified I didn't add any new warnings or errors, right? As like we're going through and doing that stuff. But like once we got to that point, like those lists and everything, it's part of the way it's built as part of the toolkit is you use a declarative method for defining the UI now. And like I just said thank you to everybody in the GTK matrix room the other day because I added a feature in Pidgin 3 in literally 3 lines of C code that would have taken me easily over 100 in GTK 2.
Wow.
Because of the declarative user interface stuff, following that list paradigm stuff, having the object stuff. And this feature, it's a silly feature, but people like it. It's so above the member list in a conversation, it tells you how many people are in the room, right? So it's just,
nice.
8 people in this room, right? 3 lines of code. That's it.
Nice. That's pretty cool. Awesome. Okay. So you sparked a memory in my mind here as you're talking about. So, okay. So you've got a team of 3. You're working on a project, Pidgin 3. You're using, say, toolkits, GTK 4. You mentioned auto tools and auto makes. So you've got your build system kind of all that.
We don't use that anymore, but
well,
yeah.
Okay. I will weave that into this question, right? You have this team, it's small but mighty, and you're maintaining and developing features for a tool. And I'm curious, like, what do you think is your successful, I guess, tactics or strategies that you're using in this space to keep the car on the road, so to speak, right?
I don't know that I'd necessarily say it's successful, but there is something that seems to be working right now.
I would say you're successful. I think it would be hard to say you're not.
Well, so what I mean by that, I mean, obviously I'm going to be my own harshest critic, but so when I took over the project in January of 2016, I was like, I'm going to have Pidgin 3 done by the end of the year. And if you've been following the news, you may know that we released Pidgin 3.0 Experimental 1 on the 1st of this year.
Right.
9 years later. So the thing is, a lot of it has just been, putting your pride on the side, looking at what's worked and what hasn't, and adjusting, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to. And like, so you were talking, you mentioned earlier about like auto tools and stuff. And I was talking earlier about, scary code base and stuff like that. Auto tools is scary. I don't care who you are. Auto tools is scary.
Yes.
I was one of the experts on the Pidgin 2 auto tools code base, and I still hated editing it. Right. Um, so a year or two into my tenure as the lead developer for Pidgin was the Mason build system got popular, started, it showed, I don't want to say showed up because it's been around a while, but it came to our attention. And we started looking at implementing it in one of our sub libraries because Pidgin is made up of a bunch of stuff. And one of the big things we've been doing is we've been separating out pieces that are useful for others, which we'll touch base on a little bit here. But so we ported one of our external libraries to Mason and went, we're doing this in Pidgin. It was no ifs, ands, or buts. It was just, this is amazing. It's a modern build system that makes a lot of sense. It makes good defaults. And more importantly, it's the same build system on every platform. And what I mean by that is many people don't know, but Pidgin 2 has 2 build systems, one for Windows and one for everything else.
I mean, everything in the world has 2 I mean, you're lucky if you only have 2 build systems.
True, but with Mason now, you can have just one.
That's pretty cool. I did not know that.
One of the other very cool things about Mason that it does is it has this feature called subprojects. So like I said, we have a bunch of external libraries that we build and maintain. So what we can do is with the subprojects is, since they're also running Mason, but Mason can also use CMake projects as a sub-library and some experimental support for auto tools. But what it'll do is it'll build that library as your dependency as part of your normal build. So like when people want to clone our source code, they don't have to grab the 6 external libraries we're currently maintaining because our build system will just pull them in and build it as part of it. And that's huge from, a developer contributor point of view.
So you're saying, I wasn't aware of this. If I build Pidgin, it will automatically pull in libpurple for me and do all the magic?
So to be fair, right now, libpurple is still in the same code base. We're going to split it up at some point.
Okay.
But we have, you're going to hate me for this, but I wrote my own Sassel library. So everybody says, don't write your own authentication if you're doing it wrong.
But Sassel is so bad. Like every library out there is terrible.
Right. So we created our own Sassel library called Hassel, HASL, the hassle-free authentication security layer, or library, whatever it is. I always forget the acronym. Because the Sassel libraries are, I'm not trying to be rude, but they're garbage, man. But more particularly, they have a bigger, I don't want to necessarily say attack surface, but they have a bigger surface because they all implement the client and server side. And for the most part, we don't care about the server side. So we ended up writing our own Sassel library. And yeah, so when you build Pidgin 3, it'll pull in that code and build it for you as part of our build. Among our plugin library, our IRC v3 library, compatibility library, our in-progress XMPP library, and our in-progress matrix library. Because, like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to... So, we as a project, we're always trying to, make things easier for other people when it comes to communication, stuff like that. A lot of people actually might not be aware of, back when we got sued by AOL for trademark infringement, which is why we changed our name.
Right.
We actually created a nonprofit foundation to act as a legal entity so that if any of these issues would come up from terms of service violations, anything about potential intellectual property rights or anything, they would sue the nonprofit and not individual developers. So one of the things, so that nonprofit is named Instant Messaging Freedom. I'm on the board, I'm the secretary. But one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to help the greater open source communication stuff like that, or, community stuff like that. So like when it was determined that we're going to write a new IRC plugin, we decided we were going to make it we were going to try to make it so it was subclassable so other people could build on top of it. That turned out to not work. Again, this is the being self-aware and going, oh, this didn't work, we got to try something else. So at that point, we split it out to a library. So like at some point, I'm going to write a Twitch protocol plugin for Purple 3, and it's going to use that same library. And then anybody else who wants a C-based library can do it. So for example, we are also doing that with XMPP because we still want to support Bonjour, which is the serverless LAN-based network. that uses XMPP to talk between people, but obviously we still need an XMPP protocol plugin to talk to, the normal XMPP network. And yeah, so like the idea, so we wanted a library for that because in Pidgin 2, we have 2 implementations of XMPP as well. There's one in the Bonjour protocol plugin, and there's one in the Jabber plugin, because that's what it was called back then.
Right.
But like the other reason too is like you may be familiar with the chat application Chatty that was originally started by Purism for the Librem phone and all that. It's kind of taken on a life of its own as in Fosh and stuff like that for open source phones. But so what they did is there was no good C XMPP library, so they basically extracted our XMPP code, kind of turned it into a library to make it work. And they say it's libpurple based, but you can't use other libpurple plugins, blah, 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 whatever. It's not a big deal. But the idea is, if we created a library that actually just worked, they wouldn't have to go through all that mess. And now having these external libraries, there's a possibility that communities will develop around them. And then, we're no longer the stewards of it. So they'll take on a life of their own and we'll just become consumers.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I have kind of one last question for you, Gary, is the thing I suspect everyone is thinking is, why don't you just rewrite Pidgin and Rust in a weekend?
The Rust question. I meant to take notes on this because I had a good point, a stinger right away to come back with it.
You just rage it all out, man.
So the first thing is number one, I don't know Rust. I am not a Rust expert. I do not have 30 years experience writing Rust.
Right.
I have 30 years experience writing C. So just for starters, me rewriting Pidgin in Rust is just a bad idea because it's just going to be a buggy mess that's going to have to, it's all going to be tech debt, right? It all just has to be thrown out immediately. But more importantly is, I just talked about all this stuff about, trying to make things reusable for others and stuff like that. And while you can do that in Rust, you don't have the same sort of interoperability that you do with C. Now, sure, you can write C-like bindings for Rust to expose to C libraries and stuff like that. But one of the big things that have come out of the GNOME camp in the recent years is this thing called G-object introspection, which basically gives you language bindings for free. And it does that based off of C libraries. So sure, you could do the same thing in Rust. You could write your entire thing in Rust, and then you could expose your C bindings, and then you could use G-object introspection to then use those C bindings to your Rust library from Python. Or you could just write it in C that you're good in, and it'll just work in Python.
Right.
So, I mean, like the Rust stuff is interesting, but one of the other things about Rust is, and this is something I don't think people realize either, is now we all know that C has lots of memory problems and the potential for that is high, right? But how old roughly was C when we realized that buffer overflows were bad and were exploitable?
It would have been the probably early to mid 90s is when they really, it really started being a thing people paid attention to.
So we're talking 20 to 25 years into C's lifespan.
C was created in the 60s, right?
Was it 60s? Okay, so then 30s.
I think so.
I was thinking it was 70s. But anyways, my point is Rust is 10 years old, 15 years old. Now, obviously information moves a lot faster and stuff like that now, but don't ever say never, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to, right? Like I've got to assume at some point someone's going to figure out some bug in the memory checker or in the borrow checker, and all of a sudden nothing's safe anymore. And you can, return object program through a Rust program, and you break through it, right? Like, look at all the stuff we tried to put into C, and people have found a way around it. I can't believe that no one's ever going to find a way around the borrow checker.
I mean, they will. Okay, I just looked. C was created in 1972. So, yeah, you were talking like 20 plus years. So right. I will give some commentary on what you just said. I suspect the borrow checker, like I've tried to trick it and I can't. And I like to think I know more about horrible C memory things than the average bear. Mm-hmm. Now, let's pretend it never gets broken because it might not. And it doesn't matter if it does or doesn't. the reality is, I think what you said at the beginning was that if you tried to port Pidgin to Rust, it would be a buggy nightmare. Because first of all, you're better at C than Rust, but more importantly is just anytime you rewrite code in another language, you're going to reintroduce a whole bunch of bugs that you probably fixed already years ago, just along the journey. And I mean, I know Daniel Stemberg from curl, he has a similar answer to what you just gave as to why why he doesn't rewrite curl in a weekend in Rust, right? Because there's always the joke of, oh, you could write curl in a weekend.
Right.
No, you can't. But
it's just request, right? It's just
right?
Python request.
Yeah, it's just a TCP request. How hard can it be? And I mean, messaging is the same, right? Where it probably feels easy, except for the 700,000 corner cases on every single interaction with a given server, right?
I've made that comment multiple times where everybody thinks chat is easy until you start adding in contact list, hyphen notifications, mentions, replies, all that stuff. And it's just like, oh yeah, this kind of sucks.
Yes, it's very hard. Exactly. So, okay. All right, Gary, I feel like you've given me a lot to chew on, and I truly appreciate that because you are definitely, I know you're going to come back because you and I chat on a regular basis, and you've got a whole bunch of amazing stories to tell, which is absolutely wonderful. But yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally at the end of the day, just, thank you for Pidgin. Thank you for the work you do, because it's, you're doing the Lord's work here, man. And like, this is the glue that holds the open source universe together, and it's awesome. So well done, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words. And I just, would like to reiterate that, Pidgin is a team effort. It always has been. We're one of the few projects that has had multiples of lead developers, people leading the charge, team, stuff like that. Now it's just my time, and we'll see when we get Pidgin 3 actually released.
Soon, right? Soon.
Yes, it's soon, TM.
All right, Gary, tell us how we can get a hold of you.
So the easiest way to find all my contact info is on my website at reaperworld.com. That's reaperworld.com.
Awesome. And I'll put links in all the places for getting us there. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary.
All right. Thanks again. Yep.